The noon sun hammered down on the rail yard outside Wolf Creek with a brutality that made iron too hot to touch and turned the air into something thick enough to choke on. The frontier town sprawled at the edge of the territories, like a collection of sun-bleached bones, its buildings leaning at angles that suggested one strong wind might knock them flat, its streets churned to fine powder by the endless passage of wagons and restless horses. At the rail yard, a line of boxcars sat motionless on the siding, and their doors chained shut, iron wheels ticking as they cooled. The locomotive hissed and spat steam, its boilers still hot from the long haul across the prairie. The smell of coal smoke and hot metal hung thick over the platform, mixing with creosote and the faint sweetness of decay. Beside a fresh pine coffin resting on a freight wagon, a man stood with his hands pressed flat against the sealed lid. His name was Akecheta, though few in Wolf Creek knew it or cared to learn. To them, he was simply the Lakota scout, spoken with casual contempt. He was a man of perhaps 30 winters, lean and hard as drought-baked earth, with muscles that moved like braided leather beneath bronze skin darkened by years of sun and wind. His long black hair was plaited tight and tied back with strips of rawhide, and a single eagle feather edges, worn soft from weather, was fixed into a plain leather headband. He wore buckskin trousers and a fringed jacket darkened by smoke and sweat, a beaded belt his grandmother had made circling his waist, and moccasins so worn they had molded to the shape of his feet. Akecheta had once been a fighter who rode with the last free bands in the Northern Territories, back when it still seemed possible that the iron rails might be stopped. But the rails had come anyway, and he had been forced to choose fight a war that could not be won or find another way to protect what remained of his people. So he had become a scout and translator for the railroad, a compromise that tasted like ash, but kept food in the bellies of children in the camps to the north. Now he stood with his hands on a coffin, and every instinct screamed that something was wrong. An older woman stood beside him, her knuckles bone white as she gripped his sleeve with trembling fingers. Her name was Adelaide Thornton, and she had the appearance of someone who had ridden too many miles on too many trains, gray braid coming loose from its pins, cotton dress patched at the elbows, face lined and weathered like old leather. "Don't open that coffin," she rasped, her voice cracking. She jabbed a crooked finger toward him. "You hear me, Lakota? Leave it shut." Akecheta did not look at her. His attention remained fixed on the coffin and the fresh pine that still smelled of sap, the brass handles that gleamed too brightly, the way the wood seemed to vibrate beneath his palms. And the sound. A faint thump from inside, then another weaker. Not the settling of dead weight. Movement, deliberate, desperate movement. He ignored her, warning, his fingers finding the iron latches and sliding them free with a metallic rasp. He gripped the edge of the lid and heaved it upward, muscles bunching across his shoulders, nails screaming as they gave way. The lid came up and sunlight flooded the coffin's dark interior. Inside was not a body wrapped in burial cloth. Instead, a girl lay curled on her side like a trapped animal, her thin body twisted to fit the narrow space. Her wrists were bound behind her back with rough hemp cord that had rubbed her skin raw and bloody, and a strip of filthy cloth was tied across her mouth. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, exposing skin mottled with bruises in shades of purple and yellow, and her dark hair was matted with sweat and dirt. But her eyes, wide and bloodshot, and fixed on Akecheta with unbearable intensity, were fully terribly alive. For one suspended heartbeat, the rail yard seemed to freeze. Then chaos exploded. "What in blazes put that lid back on?" The shout came from the nearest boxcar, where a heavy-set man with a thick black beard and cold blue eyes stood frozen, his hand already dropping to the revolver at his hip. His name was Thaddeus Caro Thick Tom to those who knew him, and he ran a freight business that serviced the remote mining camps. He had a reputation for moving goods with no questions asked. Beside him, a second man, lean and sharp-faced, also reached for his weapon. Akacheta did not hesitate. He kicked the side of the wagon hard, sending the coffin sliding backward until it thumped against the rear wheel, creating a momentary barrier. He reached in and hauled the girl out by her bound wrists, dragging her behind the wagon just as the first gunshot cracked through the air. The bullet sparked off the iron rim with a sound like a hammer on an anvil, sending metal fragments into the powder. The horse tied nearby screamed and reared eyes rolling white. Adelaide staggered backward with a cry, her hands pressed to her chest. The girl made a desperate, strangled sound behind her gag, her body rigid with terror. Akacheta crouched low, shielding her with his body, his mind working with cold clarity. The water tower stood 30 yards away, across open ground, and the best cover available. But crossing that distance under fire would be suicide. A second shot punched through the wagon with a splintering crash, the bullet passing so close to Akacheta's ear that he felt the searing heat. Then he saw her. Clara Ashford appeared from behind the freight office, her face pale but her jaw set with determination. She was a slender woman of 24, with auburn hair pinned back in a practical bun, dressed in a simple gray cotton dress. Her boots were sturdy and worn, her hands ink-stained from hours spent writing lessons. Her green eyes held intelligence and compassion that had made her an excellent teacher back in Philadelphia before her father's debts had forced her west. She had been in Wolf Creek for just over a year, teaching the children of farmers and storekeepers. She had never quite grown accustomed to the cold calculation in certain men's eyes when they looked at the older girls stepping off the orphan trains. Now she sprinted toward them, her skirts hiked to her knees, a canvas satchel bouncing against her hip. "Get down!" Akacheta shouted. But Clara was already moving her hands, reaching for the wagon brake, a heavy iron bar that lay in the powder near the wheel. She grabbed it with both hands, her arms shaking, and jammed it under the wagon's frame. Then she threw her weight against it, and the wagon tilted just enough for Akacheta to shove the coffin between it and the nearest freight car, creating a better barrier. "Run to the water tower," Akacheta barked. "Now." Clara did not argue. She grabbed the girl's other arm, and together they pulled her across the grit, their boots churning up powder bullets, singing past their heels. One shot kicked up earth so close to Clara's feet that she felt debris sting her ankles. Akacheta covered them, drawing his revolver and firing toward the boxcar to keep Tom and his partner pinned. He placed each shot with deliberate care, forcing the men to duck and scramble. They reached the water tower and ducked behind its thick wooden legs just as another bullet chewed a chunk from the support beam above Clara's head, showering her with splinters. Akacheta knelt beside the girl, his fingers working quickly at the knot holding the gag. The cloth was tied cruelly tight, and his fingers fumbled before he managed to pull it free. The girl sucked in a ragged breath and began to sob, her whole body shaking, tears cutting tracks through the grime on her cheeks. "You are safe," Akacheta said quietly, his voice steady. "Breathe slowly. You are safe now." Adelaide staggered toward them, her face ashen, her hands wringing together. "You fools," she hissed, her voice shaking. "You have no idea what you have done. You don't know who you're crossing." Clara turned on her, anger flashing in her eyes. "Who?" she demanded. "Who are we crossing, Adelaide? Who puts a living child in a coffin?" Before Adelaide could answer, the thunder of hoofbeats filled the air. Sheriff Crooked Miles arrived at the head of a hastily assembled posse, his broad-brimmed hat pulled low over eyes that missed nothing. He was a thick-bodied man with a scarred face and a reputation for enforcing the law with whatever methods proved expedient. He carried a rifle cradled in the crook of his arm. Behind him rode 6 deputies and townsmen, all armed and eager for violence. By the time Miles reined in his horse in a cloud of powder, Tom had already climbed down from the boxcar, his revolver back in its holster, His expression transformed into outraged innocence. "Sheriff," Tom called. "These people just attacked me without provocation. They're trying to steal railroad property." Miles sat easy in his saddle, his cold gaze moving across the scene. The overturned coffin, the girl with bound wrists and tear-streaked face. Akacheta and Clara crouched behind the water tower like fugitives. "That true?" Miles asked, his voice flat. "You folks interfering with Mr. Caro's business?" Clara stepped forward despite Akacheta's warning hand on her arm. She was in a coffin, Sheriff, alive, bound and gagged like an animal. Tom spread his hands in weary exasperation. "The girl's a convicted runaway thief, Sheriff. Stole money from a respectable family up in Willow Bend. We were transporting her to the Territorial Reformatory in Casper under proper authority. The coffin was just for discipline during transport, keeps troublesome prisoners from causing problems. Standard procedure. Perfectly legal." "That is a lie," Clara said, her voice shaking but defiant. "You cannot discipline a child by locking them in a coffin. That is torture." Miles dismounted his boots, hitting the ground with heavy finality. "You got proof she ain't a thief, Miss Ashford? You got paperwork saying otherwise?" Clara hesitated. She had no proof, nothing but instincts and ledger entries she had glimpsed over Adelaide's shoulder during yesterday's orphan train arrival, names scratched through the word "reassigned" written beside them. The girl clung to Clara's skirt with bound hands, her voice barely a whisper. "Please, don't let them shut me in again. Please, I can't breathe in there." Miles stopped a few feet away, his gaze moving from Clara to Akacheta with casual contempt. "This is law business, Miss Ashford, not school business." He glanced at Akacheta, and something darker entered his expression. "And it sure as blazes ain't tribal business. You'd best stay in your lane, Scout." "She is a child," Akacheta said quietly, his voice carrying an edge like a knife drawn slowly from its sheath. "You would give her back to men who put children in coffins." "I would follow the law." Miles said, his tone making it clear he considered the conversation finished. "And the law says she goes back into the custody of her legal transporter until we can sort this out proper. If she's innocent, that'll come out at the reformatory." He gestured to his deputies, two thick-necked men who looked like they enjoyed their work. "Take the girl. Lock her in the jail until the next eastbound train comes through tomorrow morning." The deputies moved forward, their hands reaching for the girl. And that was when everything fell apart. Main Street stretched through Wolf Creek, like a crooked spine, its storefronts shimmering in the midday heat, false fronts leaning at precarious angles. The wooden walkways echoed hollow under boot heels, and powder devils spun between the buildings. The deputies dragged the girl, her name was Bina, though no one had bothered to ask, toward the jailhouse at the far end of the street. She fought with desperate ferocity, her thin arms flailing, her feet kicking at shins and knees, her voice hoarse and raw. "Settle down, you little hellcat," one deputy growled. But Bina did not settle. She twisted like a snake and bit the hand of the man who held her left arm, her teeth sinking deep enough to draw blood. The deputy, a thick-necked man with a face like raw meat, raised his hand and slapped her hard across the face. The crack echoed down the street. Bina's head snapped to the side, and she sprawled in the powder blood trickling from her split lip, her eyes glazed. Akacheta moved. Akacheta. He had been following at a distance, and now he crossed the space in 3 long strides. He placed himself between the deputy and the fallen girl, his body language speaking volumes. "You hit her again," he said quietly, each word deliberate. "You answer to me." The deputy's face flushed red. "You threatening a lawman, you dirty savage." He spat the last word. "I am stating a fact." Akacheta said, his dark eyes holding the deputy's gaze. The deputy swung his baton. Lakota blocked with his forearm and drove his elbow into the man's jaw. The deputy staggered backward, spitting blood and tooth fragments. Then 3 more men piled on Lakota like wolves pulling down an elk. The fight was brutal and desperate. Lakota fought with efficiency, learned in 100 skirmishes, using his elbows and knees, his movements economical. He managed to throw one man hard into the wall of the general store and drove a knee into another's gut, hard enough to fold him over. But he was outnumbered by trained fighters. A rangy fellow brought his rifle butt down hard on the back of Lakota's head. The world exploded into white light and ringing silence, his vision fracturing. His knees buckled and he tasted powder and blood as he hit the ground. He heard Clara screaming his name as if from a great distance. He tried to rise, his arms trembling, but a boot caught him in the ribs with brutal force, and the world went dark. When consciousness returned, it came slowly, reluctantly. Lakota opened his eyes to find himself lying on a narrow cot in a stone cell. His head pounding, blood matted in his hair. His shoulders ached from the beating, his ribs felt like they had been kicked by a mule. And when he tried to sit up, nausea rolled through him. He lay back down and waited for the world to stop spinning. The jail smelled of mold and old urine and despair. Iron bars divided the interior into 2 cells separated by a narrow corridor. A single window high up admitted a shaft of powder-filtered sunlight. In the opposite cell, Bina huddled on her own cot, her knees drawn up to her chest, her arms wrapped around them. Her face was turned toward the wall. "Are you hurt badly?" Lakota asked quietly, his voice rough. She shook her head without looking up a tiny motion. "What is your name?" A long silence, then barely audible, "Bena." "I am Lakota." She glanced at him, then her eyes red-rimmed, studying his face, as if trying to determine whether he was another source of pain or something else. "They are going to put me back in the coffin," she whispered. "When the next train comes tomorrow morning, they'll nail the lid down tight and ship me east, to a house in a place called Bandit's Roost." The name hit Lakota like cold water. He knew of Bandit's Roost, everyone in the territories did. It was a mining settlement deep in the mountains, lawless even by frontier standards. The brothels there were legendary for their cruelty places, where women and girls disappeared and no one asked questions. "No," Lakota said with more conviction than he felt. "They are not." "How do you know?" Bena's voice was small, defeated. "Because I will not let them." Bena studied him for a long moment, her expression cycling through disbelief, hope, and finally wary caution. "You can't stop them. No one can. They have the law on their side." "We will see," Lakota said quietly. Footsteps echoed in the corridor outside, and both prisoners tensed. But it was Clara who appeared, carrying a woven basket covered with a checkered cloth, her face composed, but her eyes betraying worry. The guard, a bored-looking young man, unlocked the outer door after a brief exchange. Clara entered with her head held high, projecting the authority of a schoolteacher accustomed to managing unruly children. "I brought books and food for the prisoners," she announced. "Surely you cannot object to basic Christian charity." The guard, his name was Polk, shrugged with indifference. "Don't take too long." He returned to his post by the door. Clara moved to Bena's cell, first kneeling by the bars. She reached through the gap and gently took one of the girl's hands. "I am Clara Ashford," she said softly. "I teach school here in town, and I am going to help you. Do you understand me?" "Bena." Bena nodded, tears spilling over. Clara produced bread and an apple from the basket and passed them through the bars. "Eat slowly," she urged. "Your stomach will rebel if you eat too fast." Bena took the food with trembling hands and began to eat, her eyes never leaving Clara's face. Then Clara moved to Akacheta's cell, kneeling by the bars. "How badly are you hurt?" she asked quietly. "I will live," Akacheta said, though his head felt like it might split open. "Your head is bleeding." "Let me see." She reached through the bars without asking. Her fingers were cool and gentle as they probed the matted hair at the back of his skull, and he flinched despite himself. "Sorry," she murmured. "The cut is not terribly deep, but you likely have a concussion. Try not to sleep for the next few hours." "I will try," he said with faint humor. She glanced toward the guard, who was now leaning against the far wall, picking his teeth. Then she leaned closer to the bars, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I have been investigating the orphan trains," she said urgently, "keeping records of every child who passes through Wolf Creek. Girls between 12 and 16 keep disappearing from the lists, not placed with families, not sent back east, just erased." "How many girls have vanished this way?" Akacheta asked. "In the year I have been here, at least 8 that I can document. Possibly more before I arrived." She reached through the bars and pressed a folded scrap of paper into his palm, her fingers brushing his. "This is a map I drew from memory. There is an abandoned silver mine near Ghost Creek, about 15 miles north. I overheard Tom mention it once. I think that is where they take the girls before shipping them to wherever they end up." Akacheta unfolded the paper carefully. It was a rough sketch with landmarks labeled in neat script. The river crossing a stand of dead cottonwoods, a rocky outcrop shaped like a bear's head, and a cross marking a spot in the hills with the words, "Silver Mine Abandoned, 1848, written beside it. He closed his fingers over the paper, feeling the slight tremor in Clara's hand as she withdrew it. "I need to get there," she murmured. "But I cannot do it alone. I need evidence, real evidence that cannot be dismissed." Akacheta met her eyes across the bars, and in that moment, something passed between them, an unspoken agreement, a recognition that they were now bound together by something larger than themselves. "Then we get that evidence together," he said simply. A faint smile touched Clara's lips, though it did not reach her worried eyes. "First, I need to get you out of this cell. And I have an idea, but it is risky. Tell me." She glanced again at Deputy Polk. "Tonight," she whispered, "when the saloon empties and the town is distracted, I will create chaos. Be ready to move when you hear it." "What kind of chaos?" The smile widened just a fraction. "The kind that makes men forget to watch prisoners." "Clara," Akacheta began. "Trust me," she said firmly. "I know what I am doing." He looked at this schoolteacher from Philadelphia, this woman who had walked into gunfire when others turned away, who was now planning something that could get her killed, and he realized that he did trust her. "I do," he said quietly, and meant it. That evening, as the sun bled red across the western sky, Clara Ashford marched through the doors of the Silver Dollar Saloon with her ledger tucked under her arm and a look of righteous fury on her face that made even the drunkest patrons pause. The Silver Dollar was not the kind of establishment a respectable woman entered, and everyone present knew it. The air inside was thick with tobacco smoke and the sour smell of spilled beer. Conversations died as heads turned to watch Clara stride across the sawdust-covered floor. She reached the bar and slammed her ledger down with a crack that echoed through the sudden silence. "Thaddeus Caro," she announced in a voice loud enough to carry to every corner. "You have been systematically falsifying freight weights for the past 6 months and pocketing the difference. I have documented evidence right here, and I intend to report you to the territorial rail inspectors and the railroad authorities in Cheyenne." The room went dead silent. Tom, who had been sitting at a corner table with a bottle of whiskey and a hand of cards, slowly rose to his feet. His face darkened to the color of raw liver veins standing out on his forehead. The blazes, you say? Clara opened the ledger with deliberate care, turning it so the room could see columns of numbers marching down the pages. She had spent the afternoon fabricating these records with meticulous attention to detail, drawing on her memory of actual freight manifests she had glimpsed in the railroad office. 3 major shipments in the past month alone to Silver Ridge mining operations. She continued. You charged them for full loads of timber grain and machine parts totaling 8,000 pounds. But the actual delivered weight was barely 5,000 pounds. The miners are owed over $300 in materials you never delivered, Mr. Caro. That is theft, sir. Plain and simple theft. It was a magnificent bluff, a desperate gamble built on fragments of overheard conversations. But she delivered it with the absolute conviction of a schoolteacher who had caught a student cheating. And she was counting on Tom's temper. She was not disappointed. Tom lunged across the room with a bellow of rage, his chair crashing backward. You lying little. He did not finish the sentence because half the cowhands in the room, already drunk and bored and spoiling for entertainment, dove into the fray. Someone threw a punch that missed Tom entirely and caught a miner square in the jaw. The miner retaliated by smashing a bottle over someone else's head. Suddenly, the saloon erupted into a full-scale brawl, fists, flying chairs, shattering tables, overturning in glorious chaos. Sheriff Miles, who had been nursing a drink at the far end of the bar, swore viciously and rushed toward the chaos, shouting for order and waving his rifle. In the pandemonium, Clara slipped toward the back door, her heart hammering. She had never done anything remotely like this in her entire life. But she had also never stood by and watched a child be beaten and locked away, and she found that fear of failure was stronger than fear of consequences. She ran through the back alley and reached the jailhouse from the rear. Earlier that afternoon, she had visited Sheriff Miles's office and lifted the jail key from an unattended hook, her hands shaking so badly she had nearly dropped it. Now she slid that stolen key into the lock of the rear door. It took 3 tries to get the key turned, the metallic scraping seeming impossibly loud. The door swung open with a creak. Deputy Polk heard the sound and turned his eyes going wide as he recognized Clara. He opened his mouth to shout, his hand reaching for the rifle propped against the wall. But something was wrong. Polk's hand closed on empty air where the rifle should have been. Someone had moved it while he dozed. His eyes darted around in confusion. Acacheta, already on his feet, called out urgently. Clara, the key. She fumbled with the key ring and finally got the right key into the lock of Acacheta's cell. The tumblers clicked open and Acacheta burst out like a released spring. Polk had recovered enough to draw his revolver, his face flushed with panic. He started to raise the weapon toward Clara, but he never got the shot off. Acacheta crossed the distance in 3 long strides and delivered a precise strike to Polk's wrist. The revolver flew from Polk's fingers and clattered across the floor. Before Polk could recover, Acacheta wrapped one arm around the deputy's throat, applying pressure to the carotid artery in a chokehold designed to render someone unconscious quickly without causing permanent harm. Polk struggled, his hands clawing at Acacheta's arm, his boots drumming on the floor. But within 15 seconds, his eyes rolled back and his body went limp. Acacheta lowered him carefully to the floor, checking his pulse. He will wake in perhaps 10 minutes with a severe headache, he said quietly. We need to be far from here before then. He moved to Bina's cell and freed her, then ushered both Clara and the girl toward the rear door. They slipped out into the gathering darkness, the sounds of the saloon brawl still echoing from Main Street. Adelaide was waiting where Clara had told her to wait, in a narrow alley behind the general store with a rickety wagon and 2 tired horses already hitched. The old woman's face was drawn and pale, her hands trembling on the reins. I can get you off the street and out of town, Adelaide said hoarsely. But if we do this, there is no turning back. They will hunt us. Why are you helping us? Clara asked. Adelaide's jaw worked for a moment. Because I should have done something like this years ago, she said finally. Because I am tired of being a coward. Because I am tired of watching children disappear. There was no time for further questions. They climbed into the wagon, Bina sandwiched between Clara and Adelaide Acacheta, swinging up onto one of the horses. His head still throbbed, his ribs ached, but adrenaline pushed the pain into a distant corner. Adelaide snapped the reins, and the wagon lurched forward into the night. Behind them, the lights of Wolf Creek gradually faded until they were alone with the vastness of the prairie night and the whisper of wind through endless grass. They fled north under cover of darkness, the wagon creaking over the rutted road that led toward the hills, guided more by starlight than any clear sense of direction. The moon rose huge and pale over the prairie, casting long shadows that stretched across the grassland like grasping fingers. Adelaide drove with grim determination, her knuckles bone-white on the reins. Clara sat beside her, one arm around Bina, who had finally stopped shaking and now leaned heavily against her, exhausted beyond the capacity for fear or hope. Acacheta rode alongside his head, still wringing his eyes, constantly scanning the darkness behind them for signs of pursuit he knew would come. It came sooner than he expected. By the time the first light of dawn began to gray, the eastern sky, they heard the sound. They had been dreading the thunder of hoofbeats, growing louder, accompanied by shouts and the occasional crack of gunfire as warning shots were fired. "They are coming," Acacheta called out. Adelaide snapped the reins harder, but the wagon was old and heavily loaded, and the horses were worn. They could not outrun mounted men on fresh horses. "Faster," Clara urged desperately. A bullet cracked past them, then another, the shots coming more frequently as the riders closed the distance. Acacheta twisted in his saddle and returned fire with his revolver, aiming not at the barely visible shapes, but at the flashes of gunpowder, hoping to force them to slow or spread out. The range was too great for accuracy, but the shots had their intended effect and the pursuit hesitated briefly. But it was only a temporary reprieve. The road descended toward a river crossing, and even in the dim pre-dawn light, Clara could see that the water ran high and fast, swollen from recent rains. The ford was marked by wooden stakes, but the current churned white and angry over submerged rocks. Another bullet smacked into the back of the wagon with a splintering crash. Adelaide cried out and hunched lower. "I am fine," Adelaide gasped. "Just keep your heads down." "We have to cross the river," Clara shouted. "It's our only chance." Adelaide aimed the wagon toward the ford without hesitation. The horses balked at the edge, but Adelaide whipped them forward. The wagon plunged into the river. The current grabbed the wheels immediately, with shocking violence, pulling them sideways. The horses screamed and fought desperately against the water, their hooves slipping on the rocky bottom. Water surged up over the wagon bed in a cold rush, soaking their skirts and boots. Clara gasped as the frigid water reached her waist, and beside her, Bina whimpered. A rope that had been securing cargo came loose in the chaos, tangling in the lead horse's harness and pulling tight around its neck. The rope drew tighter as the horse struggled, dragging the animal's head down toward the churning water. The horse thrashed in mounting panic. "The rope!" Acacheta shouted, riding in beside them. "Cut it before it strangles the horse." Clara scrambled forward, her feet slipping on the wet boards. She reached for the rope with numb fingers, realized immediately that the knot was pulled impossibly tight, and looked back at Acacheta in desperation. He pulled his knife from his belt and tossed it to her in one smooth motion. She caught it and began sawing frantically at the rope. The current pulled at her with shocking strength, and suddenly her feet went out from under her. She was in the water up to her chest, and the icy cold stealing her breath, the current dragging her downstream. Panic flared white-hot in her chest. She could not swim, had never learned, and the river was pulling her away with inexorable power. Then a hand closed around the back of her belt, yanking her upward. Akacheta had waded in after her without hesitation, the water up to his thighs. He hauled her back toward the wagon with one hand while gripping the wagon's side with desperate strength. "I have you," he said, his voice steady. "Cut the rope. Trust yourself." Clara gasped, coughing up river water, and slashed at the rope with renewed desperation. The blade was sharp, and the hemp parted with a sudden snap. The lead horse jerked its head up, freed from the choking pressure, and lunged forward. The wagon lurched behind it, wheels finding purchase on the rocky bottom, and they clawed their way up the far bank in a spray of water and flying mud. Behind them, on the far bank, barely visible in the growing light, Tom's riders appeared, 6 mounted men silhouetted against the lightening sky. They reached the river's edge and reined in their horses, surveying the churning water. They did not attempt to cross. The current was too dangerous, and they had no desire to risk their horses or their lives. They stood on the opposite bank for a long moment, shouting curses that were swallowed by the roar of the water. For now they were safe. Clara collapsed back onto the wagon's seat, water streaming from her dress, her entire body shaking. Akacheta climbed up beside her, equally soaked. His breath coming hard, and for a long moment they simply sat there, alive and together and free, watching the sun climb over the eastern horizon. "Thank you," Clara said quietly. Akacheta nodded, too exhausted for elaborate words. "We stay together. That is how we survive." Bena huddled between them, her eyes huge, staring back at the riders on the far bank, as if unable to believe they had truly escaped. Adelaide snapped the reins once more, and the wagon resumed its journey into the hills, leaving Wolf Creek and its corruption behind in the gathering light of a new day. They reached the abandoned silver mine near Ghost Creek as the sun climbed toward its zenith, the heat building with merciless intensity. The mine sat in a hollow between 2 ridges, half buried by wind-blown sand and skeletal sagebrush. The head frame leaned drunkenly to one side, its timbers rotted through. The office building was a gutted shell, its roof caved in and its walls sagging. But there were recent wagon tracks in the powder-deep ruts, cut into the earth by heavy loads. Akacheta dismounted and knelt to examine them. 2 wagons, he said quietly. Heavy loads moving slowly, within the last 3 or 4 days at most. Clara felt her stomach tighten. This is the place. This has to be it. They approached the office building with extreme caution, Akacheta leading with his revolver drawn, Clara following with the old shotgun clutched in her hands. Adelaide and Bena stayed with the wagon and horses. The inside of the office was thick with powder and the smell of old wood and rust and something else. Something organic and unpleasant that made Clara's stomach turn. Rows of coffins lined the walls, stacked 2 and 3 high. Not old coffins, but fresh ones, their wood still pale and unseasoned, their brass handles gleaming dully. But mixed among the coffins were other containers, large wooden crates with rope handles, sealed barrels with iron bands, and canvas-covered bundles strapped with leather. Clara moved to the nearest coffin and ran her hand over the smooth pine. Why would they need so many coffins and crates here? Adelaide stood in the doorway, her face gray. To hide the girls. They ship them in whatever container won't be questioned, coffins sealed with death certificates claiming fever victims, crates labeled as mining equipment barrels supposedly containing salt pork. No one questions sealed containers on a freight train, especially coffins. No one wants to risk infection. It is... Her voice broke. It is the perfect crime because it hides in plain sight. Bena stood very still, staring at the coffins and crates. They tried to put me in one for the journey to Bandit's Roost, she said hollowly. They said I would only be inside for a few hours. but I heard them talking when they thought I was unconscious from the drug they gave me. They were going to seal it properly once I was loaded, and I would have suffocated before anyone opened it again. Akacheta moved to a desk in the corner, its surface buried under scattered papers. He began rifling through them methodically. Freight manifests, shipping receipts, bills of lading. And then, at the bottom of a drawer, wrapped in oilcloth, he found 2 ledgers. They were thick and leather-bound, the kind of accounting books used by businesses to track transactions over months or years. He unwrapped them carefully and opened the first to its initial page. Columns of names marched down the pages in neat script. Beside each name, a date and age, a physical description, and a payment amount. Some entries included additional notes written in the margins: compliant, resisting extra handling required, damaged in transport price reduced, deceased no refund. The words were clinical businesslike, reducing human beings to inventory. Akacheta flipped through the pages, his jaw tightening, his hands beginning to shake. Names blurred past a litany of stolen lives. Then he froze completely, his finger pressed against a name written in ink that had faded to brown but was still clearly legible. Malia, Lakota, age 15, physical strong, good teeth resisting, reassigned to Bandit's Roost, payment 75, status deceased, February 1869. Beside it, a date from 3 years ago. And in the margin, in a different hand, a single additional note fire. The world tilted sideways. Akacheta had known on some rational level that his sister was likely dead. 3 years without any word, without any sign, in a land as harsh as the territories, the odds had never been good. But seeing her name reduced to a ledger entry, her life valued at $75, the word deceased, written with casual indifference, it drove the air from his lungs and made something crack inside his chest. His vision grayed at the edges. Clara moved to his side immediately. She read over his shoulder and sucked in a sharp breath. "Your sister?" she asked quietly. Akacheta nodded, unable to speak, his eyes burning. Clara placed her hand over his where it rested on the page. "I am so very sorry," she whispered. "I am so sorry, Akacheta." Before he could respond, Adelaide spoke from behind them with a voice so raw and broken it barely sounded human. "I signed for her." They turned to stare at her in shock. Adelaide stood in the doorway, her face wet with tears, her shoulders sagging. "Your sister, Malia. I signed the release papers that put her into their custody. I am the one who gave her to them." Akacheta rose slowly, the ledger still clutched in his hand, his dark eyes burning. "Explain," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Those men, Tom and his partner, they came to our train when we stopped in Willow Bend 3 years ago in the spring." Adelaide's voice shook. "They said they had a respectable family who wanted an older girl, someone strong enough to help with farm work. They had papers that looked official, signed by what appeared to be a territorial judge's seal. I believed them. Or I wanted to believe them, because believing was easier than questioning." She wiped at her face with trembling hands. "When Malia fought them, when she screamed that she did not want to go with these men, when she tried to run and they grabbed her, they told me she was just frightened and confused. I should have known better. I should have listened to her. But I did not." "But you did not," Akacheta repeated, his voice flat and hard. "No," Adelaide whispered. "I did not. When she kept fighting, they put her in one of the coffins, right there on the platform where everyone could see. They said it was standard procedure for discipline that she would be let out once they were away from town. And I stood there and watched them nail the lid down while she screamed inside. I stood there and did nothing, and I have carried that weight every single day since. She sank onto a broken chair, her face buried in her hands. I have been riding those terrible trains for 7 years. Do you have any idea how many girls I have watched disappear, how many times I signed papers and told myself it was all legitimate, that these were good families offering homes to orphans, dozens, maybe hundreds over the years. I kept records, made sure their names stayed on the official pages in my personal journal, convinced myself that documenting their existence was enough, that bearing witness was the same as action. She looked up at Akacheta. But it was never enough. I never protected them. I never protected your sister when she needed someone to stand up for her. I failed her, and I have failed so many others, and I will carry that guilt to my grave. Akacheta's hands clenched into fists at his sides. His anger was not the hot, explosive kind that burned itself out quickly. It was cold and deep, and controlled the kind of rage that settled into bone and stayed there. But before he could speak, gunfire erupted outside with shocking suddenness. Bullets punched through the thin walls with sounds like the world tearing apart, sending splinters flying in deadly clouds. A window exploded inward in a shower of glass. The air filled instantly with smoke and noise and the acrid smell of gunpowder. "Down!" Akacheta shouted, grabbing Clara and pulling her behind the desk. Through the broken window he could see figures moving among the rocks on the ridgeline above them. Tom's riders, who had somehow managed to circle around, crossed the river at a different ford and tracked them to the mine. They had the high ground and clear fields of fire. They followed us. Adelaide gasped, crawling toward them on hands and knees. They must have crossed the river miles upstream where it narrows. Akacheta grabbed both ledgers and shoved them into his jacket, then pulled Clara and Bina toward the doorway that led deeper into the mine complex. "Out the back, move quickly." They ran through a series of collapsing structures, boards cracking and splintering under their feet, powder raining from the ceilings with every impact of bullets. Behind them, the shouts of the riders grew closer. The only route left was into the mine itself. The tunnel entrance was a black mouth in the hillside, shored up with rotting timbers that groaned under the weight of the earth, pressing down from above. Akacheta snatched up a kerosene lantern that hung by the entrance and lit it with shaking hands. Then he led the way inside into darkness and danger and the unknown. The tunnel sloped downward at a steep angle, the walls rough stone that glittered with veins of quartz catching the lantern light. The air grew colder with each step, damp and heavy smelling of earth and minerals. Overhead, the timbers creaked ominously, and small streams of dirt trickled down from cracks in the ceiling. "This place is not stable," Clara said, her voice tight. She had never liked enclosed spaces, and the tunnel seemed to press in on her from all sides, and the darkness beyond the lantern's small circle absolute and suffocating. "It is the only way," Akacheta said grimly. Behind them, they heard the riders enter the tunnel, their voices echoing off the stone walls, growing distorted and strange. "Split up!" Tom's voice boomed through the darkness. "They can't have gone far. Flush them out." The tunnel branched ahead, splitting into 3 passages that angled off in different directions. Akacheta paused for only a heartbeat, then chose the middle passage, the one that angled slightly upward, suggesting it might lead to another level or perhaps another exit. They moved as quickly as they dared, and the lanterns swinging wildly, their shadows leaping and twisting. The passage narrowed until they had to move single file, Akacheta leading, then Bina, then Clara, with Adelaide bringing up the rear, limping badly on a leg she had injured during their flight. Then, with a sound like the gods themselves tearing the world apart, one of the main support beams behind them gave way. The ceiling collapsed in a roaring cascade of rock and timber and earth. The sound so loud it was felt more than heard, a physical pressure that slammed into them and drove the air from their lungs. The blast of displaced air extinguished the lantern, plunging them into absolute darkness. Adelaide screamed a sound, cut short with terrible abruptness. "Adelaide!" Clara's voice cracked with horror. In the darkness, Akacheta fumbled for matches, finally managing to strike one. The tiny flame revealed devastation. The tunnel behind them was completely blocked by tons of rubble, and Adelaide was trapped beneath it, her leg pinned at an unnatural angle, blood pooling dark and terrible on the stone floor. The old woman's face was gray, slick with sweat, but her eyes were open and eerily calm. "Go," she gasped. "Get them out. The whole mine is unstable. Another collapse will come." "We are not leaving you," Clara said fiercely, already moving toward her, trying to shift the rocks. "You cannot move it," Adelaide said, and she was right. The timber was massive, the rocks too heavy. "Listen to me. There is something you must know about Malia." Akacheta froze the match, burning down toward his fingers. Adelaide's breathing was labored blood, bubbling at the corner of her mouth, a sign of internal injury. "After they took her to Bandit's Roost, I kept track as best I could through contacts through whispers. In February of that year, there was a fire at the main brothel. A terrible fire that burned half the building." She coughed, and more blood came darker now. "The madame who ran the place survived, and she told anyone who would listen that your sister could have escaped easily. The door was open, the way was clear. But she went back inside. She went back for the younger girls, the ones too frightened or too drugged to move. She led 5 of them out through the smoke and flames. Then she went back a third time for 2 more who were trapped upstairs." Tears streamed down Adelaide's face. The building collapsed on her during that third trip. The roof came down, and she was buried in the flames. But those 7 girls lived because of her courage. I wrote it all down, every detail I could learn, in the second ledger. Page 47. I wanted someone to know. I wanted her to be remembered as a hero, not just another entry in a book of crimes. Akacheta's throat closed tight, his vision blurring. "She died saving others." Adelaide whispered, her voice growing fainter. "Just like you would have done. Just like you are doing now." Her eyes found Baina. "Save this one. Save all of them you can. That is how you honor her memory." A distant rumble echoed through the mine, and more dirt rained from the ceiling. "Go!" Adelaide's voice gained sudden strength. "Before it all comes down, go, or her death means nothing." Akacheta struck another match, relit the lantern, and met Adelaide's eyes for one long moment that held more communication than words could carry. Then he nodded once sharply. "Your name will be remembered," he said quietly. "You will be honored for choosing courage when it mattered most." Adelaide smiled faintly, blood staining her teeth, and her eyes closed. They ran. The tunnel they followed opened into a wider chamber after what felt like an eternity of stumbling through darkness. It was an old work area where miners had once extracted ore from the walls. Rusted equipment lay scattered about, picks with broken handles, shovels bent, and useless ore carts on deteriorating rails. And across the chamber, another tunnel mouth gaped, this one with fresher timbers and what looked like natural light filtering down from somewhere above. "There," Clara pointed. "That must lead to a ventilation shaft or another entrance." But before they could reach it, gunfire erupted from the passage behind them. Tom and 2 of his men burst into the chamber, their guns blazing. Bullets sparked off the stone walls and ricocheted wildly, the sound deafening. Akacheta shoved Clara and Bina behind an ore cart and returned fire. His first shot took one of Tom's men high in the shoulder, spinning the man around. The man went down hard, his rifle clattering away. The other man dove for cover behind a support timber. How many bullets do you have left? Clara asked urgently. Akacheta checked his cylinder by feel. 3, maybe 4. I have the shotgun, Clara said. 2 shells. It was not enough. Not against 3 armed men. Akacheta's mind raced, cataloging the chamber in the flickering lantern light. The rusted ore carts. The deteriorating support timbers already groaning under strain from the earlier collapse. The ventilation shaft that promised escape but required crossing open ground under fire. An idea formed desperate and dangerous. When I move, he said quietly to Clara, you take Bina and run for that far tunnel. Do not stop. Do not look back. Promise me. What are you? Clara began. Trust me, Akacheta said. One last time. Trust me. Clara hesitated, but she saw the determination in his face and knew that arguing would waste the only chance they had. Together, she said fiercely. We survive together or not at all. Then we survive, Akacheta said. Now run when I give the signal. He grabbed the lantern by its wire handle and hurled it with all his strength toward the nearest support timber, one of the old rotted ones that looked ready to fail. The lantern shattered against the wood in a spray of glass, and kerosene and flames roared up the timber. Fire spread quickly to the ceiling, supports the dry old wood catching instantly. What have you done? Tom screamed from across the chamber. You'll bring the whole mountain down on us. Yes, Akacheta said coldly, rising and firing his remaining shots toward Tom's position. Run or die, Caro. Your choice. For a moment, nothing happened except the spreading flames and the ominous groaning of timbers. Then a deep groan resonated through the stone itself, and the burning timber began to sag. Cracks spread across the ceiling like black lightning. One of Tom's men broke completely and ran back the way they had come, heading toward the main tunnel. But Tom and his remaining man opened fire with renewed fury bullets, chewing up the ore cart. Go! Akacheta shouted to Clara. Now run! Clara grabbed Bena's hand and ran zigzagging across the open space as bullets whined past them. The shotgun kicked hard in her free hand as she fired blindly behind her, not aiming, just creating noise and fear. They reached the far tunnel and disappeared into its mouth. Akacheta rose from behind the ore cart and sprinted across the chamber as the ceiling began to collapse behind him in a progressive failure. He dove into the tunnel mouth just as a massive section of roof crashed down where he had been standing, sealing the chamber behind him in a cloud of choking dust. He lay in the darkness for a moment, gasping for breath. Then he heard Clara's voice ahead, calling his name with desperate urgency. Here, he managed to croak. I am here. He pushed himself up and moved forward by feel, following the sound of Clara's breathing. Then he saw light ahead, real daylight, filtering down from above. The tunnel opened into a natural chimney, a vertical shaft worn through the rock by centuries of water erosion. Rough handholds had been carved into the stone by miners long ago, creating a primitive ladder that led upward toward a ragged circle of sky, perhaps 30 feet above. Can you climb? Akacheta asked Bina, his voice gentle. The girl looked up at the daunting height and nodded with determination. Yes, I can climb. They climbed. Bina went first, her small size making the ascent easier despite her fear. She moved with desperate focus. Clara followed, her skirts hampering her, but her determination driving her upward. Akacheta came last, his injured ribs screaming with every pull, his arms trembling with exhaustion. They were perhaps 20 feet up when Akacheta heard a sound from below that turned his blood to ice. Tom had made it through the collapse. Thought you could bury me, savage. Tom's voice echoed up the shaft. I've been through worse than a little rock fall, and now you got nowhere left to run. A gunshot cracked the bullet, spanging off the rock inches from Akacheta's hand. He could not return fire. Both hands were occupied, keeping him from falling, and his revolver was empty anyway. "Climb faster," he urged those above him. Clara and Bina scrambled upward with renewed desperation. Clara reached the top first and hauled herself over the edge, then immediately turned and reached down for Bina. Another shot rang out closer. The bullet tugged at Akacheta's jacket, passing through the leather without hitting flesh by the narrowest of margins. He was 10 feet from the top when his injured ribs finally betrayed him. Pain lanced through his chest like a hot knife, and his left hand slipped on the rough stone. He dangled by one arm, his feet scrabbling for purchase, suspended above a drop that would shatter every bone in his body. Clara's face appeared over the edge, her eyes wide with horror. "Hold on." She lay flat on her stomach and reached down with both arms extended. Her fingers brushed his too far apart to grasp. Below, Tom was climbing now too, a revolver clenched in his teeth, his face twisted with murderous intent. Akacheta found a foothold and pushed upward with everything he had left. His hand closed around Clara's wrist, and hers closed around his with a grip like iron. She pulled her face, going red with effort. And he clawed his way up the last few feet until he could get his elbows over the edge. Together, they scrambled back from the shaft opening just as Tom's head appeared below, perhaps 12 feet down. He spat the revolver from his mouth into his hand and raised it. Clara still held the empty shotgun. Without thinking, acting on pure instinct, she swung it like a club, bringing the heavy wooden stock down hard on Tom's gun hand just as he fired. The shot went wild, and the revolver tumbled from Tom's grip, falling back down the shaft with a clatter. For a moment, Tom hung there at his face, cycling through shock, fury, and finally realization. His grip failed, fingers slipping on stone, and he fell backward with a scream that echoed up the shaft and was cut short by a sickening crunch as he hit bottom 30 feet below. They lay there on the rocky ground, gasping for air that had never tasted sweeter. After a long moment, Akacheta pushed himself up onto his knees and looked down the shaft. Far below, Tom's body lay sprawled at unnatural angles, motionless. "Is he?" Clara could not finish. "Yes," Akacheta said simply. "He is dead." Benna began to cry, not from fear now, but from relief so profound it had to escape somehow. They were on the hillside above the mine, the afternoon sun warm on their faces. Behind them, smoke rose from the mine entrance in lazy spirals, and even as they watched, more of the tunnel system collapsed inward with a distant rumble sealing the horrors beneath tons of rock. "Adelaide." Clara whispered, fresh tears streaming down her face. "She saved us," Akacheta said quietly. "She chose how her story would end. She chose redemption over survival. That is not a small thing." He pulled the 2 ledgers from inside his jacket. They were battered, stained with blood and powder and river water, but intact. Page 47 of the second ledger fell open as if it had been opened many times before. There, in Adelaide's neat script, was a detailed account of the fire at Bandit's Roost, and a description of Malia's actions written with care and respect. Her name was Malia. She was 15 years old. She could have escaped the fire easily, but she chose to go back inside. She saved 7 girls that night by leading them through the smoke and flames. She died when the building collapsed during her 3rd trip back inside. Their names are Sarah Mitchell, Margaret O'Brien, Chen Lee Rose, Blackwood, Maria Gonzalez, Littlebird, and Abigail Thornton. They lived because of her courage and sacrifice. May someone someday tell her family that she did not die in vain. May they know she was a hero. Akacheta closed the ledger carefully and held it against his chest for a long moment. His eyes closed against tears that finally fell freely, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs that released 3 years of grief. Clara moved closer and wrapped her arms around him, holding him as he grieved, offering no words, because sometimes there were no words adequate, just presence. and the silent promise that he did not carry this alone. After a time, Akacheta opened his eyes and looked at the ledgers. "We finished this," he said finally, his voice rough but steady. "For Adelaide, for Malia, for Bina and all the others whose names fill these pages. We make sure they are not forgotten. We make sure justice comes." Clara took his hand and squeezed it. "Together." "Together," he agreed. They walked for the rest of that day and into the evening, following Ghost Creek downstream until it joined a wider river, then following that river north toward the town of Medicine Bow. Clara remembered it from her train journey west as a real town with brick buildings, a telegraph office, and most importantly, a federal marshal's outpost. They traveled slowly, their bodies battered beyond anything Clara had ever experienced. Akacheta's ribs were definitely broken, at least 2 of them, and every breath sent knives of pain through his chest. Clara's hands were cut and bruised from the climb, scraped raw and bleeding. Bina limped on a twisted ankle, but never complained. On the evening of the second day, as the sun painted the western sky crimson, they reached a small homestead where a Norwegian family took them in without questions. The farmer, a weathered man named Olaf, simply nodded when they appeared at his door. His wife Ingrid fed them soup thick with vegetables and fresh bread. She tended their wounds with capable hands, clucking her tongue at the state of them, but asking nothing. They slept in the barn that night, in clean hay that smelled of summer, and for the first time in days, Clara felt something approaching safety. The next morning, Olaf hitched his wagon without being asked. "I take you Medicine Bow," he said in heavily accented English. "No payment is right thing." True to his word, the farmer drove them north through country that grew gradually less wild. He asked no questions about the ledgers Akacheta kept inside his jacket or the hunted way they kept watching their back trail. Medicine Bow was larger than Wolf Creek by half a real town, with brick buildings, a proper hotel, multiple saloons, a church with a bell tower, and most importantly, a substantial building that housed both the telegraph office and the federal marshal's depot. The marshal, a weathered man in his 50s, named Henry Gaines, who had the look of someone who had seen every variety of human evil and been disappointed but not surprised, listened to their story with an expression that grew progressively darker. He examined the ledgers, carefully read Adelaide's notes with increasing focus, and heard Bina's testimony delivered in a small, clear voice that never wavered. When they finished, Gaines set the ledgers down with deliberate care and was silent for a long moment. "This is bigger than I thought," Gaines said finally. "These entries implicate people all the way up to the territorial capital. I'm seeing names here I recognize: businessmen, a territorial judge, even a deputy governor. Blast it all?" He looked up, his eyes hard. "I'll need to send telegrams to the U.S. Attorney in Denver immediately. This is going to shake things up from here to Washington. There'll be trials, investigations. It won't be quick." "What about Wolf Creek?" Clara asked. "Sheriff Miles is part of this. The whole town is corrupted." "I'll ride to Wolf Creek myself with federal warrants and enough deputies to make it stick," Gaines promised. "Miles will hang for his part in this. You have my word on that, Miss Ashford. And you too, Akacheta. Justice will be served." Gaines arranged for them to stay in a small boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Chen. Over the next few days, as they recovered and tried to process everything, and the wheels of justice began to turn with surprising speed. Telegrams flew back and forth between Medicine Bow and Denver. Federal agents arrived from Denver by train, grim-faced men in dark suits who interviewed them for hours. Within a week, a small army of federal marshals rode into Wolf Creek with warrants. They arrested Sheriff Miles, 3 of his deputies, and 5 prominent businessmen. The brothels in Bandits' Roost were raided in a dangerous operation that resulted in a pitched gun battle. 3 federal marshals died, along with 7 brothel guards. But ultimately, the raids freed 17 women and girls, including 3 of the 7 that Malia had saved from the fire 3 years earlier. The trials would take months, Gaines warned them. But the evidence was overwhelming, and convictions were certain. "You did good work," Gaines told Akacheta and Clara as they sat in his office. "Dangerous work that could have gotten you killed a dozen times over, but good work. The territory owes you both a debt." "The territory does not owe us," Akacheta said quietly, touching the ledgers. "It owes them, the ones whose names fill these pages. We just made sure it paid what was owed." Gaines nodded slowly, respect clear in his weathered face. "Fair enough. What will you do now, both of you?" Clara and Akacheta exchanged a glance that held more communication than words. "That," Clara said slowly, "is something we are still figuring out." 6 weeks after their escape from the mine, on a clear morning in early autumn, when the cottonwoods were turning gold, and the air carried the first hint of winter, Akacheta and Clara stood on a hillside overlooking what had once been an unmarked piece of prairie, but was now something more. 2 graves stood side by side, marked with wooden crosses and proper headstones carved by a stonemason in Medicine Bow. The first was Adelaide Thornton's grave. The headstone read, "Adelaide Thornton, 1821-1872. She died protecting children she could have abandoned. In the end, she chose courage over safety, redemption over survival." The second was for Malia, though her body had never been recovered. But Akacheta had wanted a place to remember her, to honor her. The headstone, carved with both English and symbols from his people's tradition, read, "Malia, daughter of the Lakota, 1854-1869. She died saving 7 lives from fire. She was a warrior and a hero. Her courage will be remembered." Beside each grave, Clara had planted wildflowers, prairie roses, and black-eyed Susans that would bloom again come spring. A small group had gathered for the ceremony. Marshal Gaines stood with his hat in his hands. Dr. Sebastian Hale had traveled up from Wolf Creek to attend, as had Evander the farmer and his family. The Norwegian family, Olaf and Ingrid, and their 3 children, stood together. And standing beside Akacheta were 3 members of his Lakota band who had traveled south when word reached them, an elder named Two Hawks, a woman named White Deer, who had been Malia's closest friend, and a young warrior named Running Crow. Two Hawks spoke first in the old language words that honored the dead and asked the spirits to guide them on their journey beyond this world. His voice carried across the prairie like wind through grass. White Deer sang next, a mourning song that was beautiful and terrible all at once, her voice rising and falling in patterns that spoke of loss and memory. Several listeners found tears streaming down their faces. Then Akacheta spoke in English so all could understand. "My sister Malia died far from home, far from her people, in circumstances no one should have to face," he began. "But she did not die a victim. She died a warrior choosing to fight for others when she could have saved only herself. That choice honored our people more than any battle ever could." His voice grew stronger. "I spent 3 years searching for her, hoping I might find her alive. I did not find her alive. But I found the truth of how she died. And that truth transforms grief into something else, into pride. Into gratitude that she lived even if she did not live long. Into determination that her sacrifice will not be forgotten." He looked at Adelaide's grave. Adelaide Thornton carried guilt for many years, believing she could not make amends for the harm she had allowed. But in the end, she proved that it is never too late to choose courage. She died as my sister died, protecting those who could not protect themselves. His gaze moved to Clara standing beside him with Bina's hand held tight in hers. Both these women taught me that family is not only blood, it is choice, it is action. It is standing beside those who need you, even when it costs everything. Two hawks stepped forward and placed small carved stones on each grave, marked with symbols that spoke of honor and sacrifice in their tradition. White deer laid sprigs of sage bound with leather cord, and Running Crow added a single eagle feather to Malia's grave. Dr. Sebastian said a brief prayer that invoked mercy and peace for the departed and strength for those left behind. The ceremony concluded with silence, a long, respectful quiet, in which each person stood with their own memories and thoughts. Afterward, as the others began to drift away, and the afternoon sun climbed toward its peak, Akacheta and Clara remained standing together beside the graves, with Bina between them. "What will you do now?" Clara asked quietly. Akacheta was silent for a long moment, watching the wind move through the grass. "I have been thinking about that question. My people are being pushed onto reservations, forced to give up the old ways, and that fight continues. But I think I can serve them better by doing what we did with Bina, by fighting the battles that happen in shadows, by protecting those who fall through the cracks." He turned to look at her directly. "Marshal Gaines offered me a position as a deputy federal marshal. It would be official with legal authority to investigate crimes against Native peoples across the territory. I would be based here in Medicine Bow, but travel is needed. It would be dangerous work, but work that matters." Clara's heart did something strange in her chest, a leap that was equal parts hope and fear. "And will you accept his offer?" "That depends," Akacheta said carefully. "I heard you tell Gaines you were not returning to Wolf Creek." "No," Clara confirmed. "Too many bad memories. But Medicine Bow needs a school teacher. The town council offered me the position 4 days ago. Better pay a real schoolhouse with proper windows and enough books for all the students and a small house that comes with the job." "That sounds like a good opportunity," Akacheta said neutrally. "It is," Clara agreed. "But I told them I needed to think about it." "Why?" The question was direct, curious. Clara took a breath. "Because I have a daughter now. The territorial judge made it official last week. I'm Bina's legal guardian. And before I accept a position and put down roots somewhere, I need to make sure it's the right place to raise a child. Somewhere safe. Somewhere with people we can trust." She finally turned to face him, fully meeting his eyes. "People like you." Akacheta felt something in his chest that had been frozen solid for 3 years begin to thaw. "I cannot promise there would not be danger," he said honestly. "This work is not safe. There will be times I am away for days or weeks. There will be risks I cannot avoid." "I'm not asking for safety," Clara said, her voice gaining strength. "I'm asking if you would stay, if you would be part of this, part of us." Her cheeks flushed slightly, but she held his gaze. "Not because we're helpless women who need a man to protect us. We've proven we can survive on our own. But because over these past weeks, I have come to trust you in ways I have never trusted anyone. And I think Bina feels the same. And I think you need a family as much as we need you. I think you need a place to belong that isn't defined by loss or duty, but by choice." Akacheta looked down at Bina, who had been listening quietly. The girl looked up at him with eyes that were still haunted, but held hope now too. "Would you want that?" he asked her directly. "Would you want me to stay, to be part of your family?" Bina bit her lip, thinking carefully. "You saved me," she said finally. "You and Clara both saved me when no one else would. And you didn't have to. You could have walked away. But you didn't." She paused. I think people who choose to save someone are the best kind of family. Not the family you're born with, but the family you make by choosing each other. Out of the mouths of children, Akecheta thought came wisdom that adults often forgot. I am not an easy man to live near, he warned again, wanting to be completely honest. My ways are different. I was raised in a culture white society does not understand and often fears. There will be people in Medicine Bow who will never accept me, who will say cruel things and make life difficult. And being associated with me, being seen as my family, that may bring some of that prejudice onto both of you as well. Let them talk, Clara interrupted with surprising fierceness. I don't care what small-minded people think. I care about doing what's right and building something good from all this darkness. And I believe we could do that. Together. Not despite our differences, but because of them. Because you see things I don't see, know things I don't know, bring strengths I don't have. That's what real family is. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers interlacing with his. I'm not asking you to be something you're not. I'm asking you to be exactly who you are, but to be that person here with us. To let us be your family. Akecheta looked down at their joined hands, her pale fingers interlaced with his darker ones, both scarred and calloused, both strong. Then he looked at Bina, who was watching them with hope and fear of disappointment. Together, he said quietly the word carrying weight and commitment. Yes, I think we could build something good together. I think you are right. I do need a family. I did not realize how much until you offered it. And I would be honored to be part of yours. Clara smiled, and it transformed her face completely. Then it settled. We'll all stay in Medicine Bow. We'll build a life here. Together. Bina, unable to contain herself, threw her arms around both of them in a fierce hug. They held her between them, this child they had saved, and who had saved them in return by giving them purpose and hope, and a future worth building. Spring came to Medicine Bow with a riot of wildflowers and the return of songbirds. The schoolhouse hummed with the voices of 23 children, reciting their lessons under Clara's patient guidance. At the back of the classroom, Bena sat with a slate and chalk, helping a younger girl practice her letters. The child who had been found in a coffin 7 months ago was almost unrecognizable now, healthy weight-restored nightmares, fading a smile that came more readily each passing week. After school, as the children spilled out into the spring sunshine with shouts and laughter, Clara tidied her desk. Through the window, she could see Akecheta riding in from the south, his horse dusty from the trail. He had been gone for 5 days investigating reports of contract fraud affecting a northern Cheyenne settlement. From the set of his shoulders, Clara could tell the investigation had been difficult but successful. Mama Clara. Bena appeared at her elbow, using the name that had become natural over the past months. Is he back? Yes, sweetheart, he's back. Let's go meet him. They walked out together. Akecheta saw them approaching, and something in his usually stern face softened. Successful? Clara asked as they drew near. The contractors are under arrest. The Northern Cheyenne will receive the supplies they were promised. He looked tired but satisfied. How were things here? Quiet, peaceful, exactly the way we like it, Clara said with a smile. Though Bina received another letter today. From Rose, one of the girls Malia saved. She's been accepted into a teaching college in Boston. Over the past months, letters had arrived regularly from the 7 girls Malia had saved, the ones who had survived and been located. They wrote to Bena and to Akecheta, sharing their lives, their progress. It was Bena's self-appointed task, to collect and preserve these letters in a wooden box, a tangible record of how one person's courage rippled outward. Akacheda's expression flickered with something that might have been pain or pride or both. That is good. That is very good. She honors Malia's sacrifice by making something of the life she was given. That evening, after supper, in the small but comfortable house that had become home, Akacheta sat on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the sun paint the western sky crimson and gold. Clara came out to join him, settling into the chair beside his with a contented sigh. "Marshal Gaines sent word by telegraph," Akacheta said. "The last of the trials concluded last week. Sheriff Miles was hanged in Cheyenne 3 days ago. The territorial judge who signed the false documents lost his position and received 10 years in federal prison. 3 others received life sentences." "Good," Clara said with quiet satisfaction. "Justice delayed, but not denied." Adelaide would have been pleased to know that her testimony, her written accounts in those ledgers, were the evidence that secured several convictions. "She redeemed herself," Clara agreed softly. "Not perfectly, not completely. The harm she allowed cannot be undone. But enough. She chose to act when action mattered most, and that choice made all the difference." They sat in comfortable silence as the light faded and stars began to appear. Inside, they could hear Bina singing softly as she worked on her evening lessons, her voice carrying through the open window. A family built from tragedy and choice, building a life one day at a time. Outside, the stars wheeled slowly overhead in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human joy or sorrow, but bearing witness, nonetheless, to the small acts of courage and compassion that made civilization possible. And on the wind, if you listened very carefully with a heart open to such things, you might have heard voices, women's voices, singing songs of freedom and sacrifice, songs of remembrance, songs of hope, songs that said, "We were here. We mattered. We are not forgotten." The names remained carved in stone and written in ledgers and carried in the hearts of those who chose to remember. And in the end, that made all the difference.